the fact of the matter is that storytelling is really, really hard. People do not say that enough. I don't care who it is, if it's Judd or if it's Ira or if it's anybody I work with. At some point you're in the room and you're just sitting there like this and you're like, I don't know how to solve this thing. You know what I mean? And that happens all the time. And I think the difference is that the good people just keep fighting through it.
Joe Beshenkovsky is the Emmy award-winning editor behind This American Life. His films include Objectified, Cobain, Montage of Heck, and Judd Apatow's The Zen Diaries of Garry Shandling. On this episode, we go deep into what it takes to tell a great story. Every creative can get something out of this, but specifically, I want all you filmmakers out there to stick around and listen to this entire episode. There are dozens of takeaways and gems that you can start implementing today. Some of these storytelling techniques that we cover, why it's important to have subjects speak from a place of authority, why it's important to trim out the fat, to never repeat yourself, organizing your projects, and keeping your audience guessing but not confused. There's a very fine line and a very, very fine balance that you have to go down as a filmmaker and as an editor. And Joe is a true master. If you watch any of his documentaries, you can see in the editing. Now, it may take a professional to be able to see the nuances, but his style just carries you through, and he pulls you through the film in a way that's not so obvious. And it's a true art, and I don't think we give enough credit to editors for the work that they do on both films, TV shows, across the board. So, again, not just for filmmakers, storytellers in general, I think you're going to love it. And it's just cool to see behind the scenes at some great films and documentaries, to see that other people are struggling with the same shit that you're going through. It's always encouraging to see. One quick thing before we get into it. I hope you've been enjoying the podcast. I hope you've been getting some value out of it and finding things that you can implement into your own creative journey, your own creative hustle. If you have been getting some value, I would love it if you could do me one small favor. Head over to iTunes, leave a quick rating, tell me a little bit about why you like the show, the value you've gotten out of it, and that's it. That to me, it means a lot, but it also helps to increase the awareness of our show and the visibility to make sure that we're ranking on iTunes. So then more people see the show, more people get value out of it, and we can hopefully help others on their own ground up story. All right. What do you say we get to this week's podcast? This is the great and talented Joe Beshenkovsky. You're listening to The Ground Up Show, a podcast that inspires creatives to make meaningful content and pursue their passions. My name's Matt Diavella, and I'm a filmmaker best known for the Netflix documentary Minimalism. And I'm sitting down with creators to talk about their process, the lessons they've learned, and how to make an impact. Check. You just finished up a little doc, 4.5 hour little doc.
I did, yeah.
Do you normally do big projects? Is it like one big one to the next?
Are you talking about like high profile or physical scale?
In terms of like the length of how immersed you are on a project.
I mean, I don't think we ever went into that project saying, hey, it's going to be 2 parts in 4.5 hours. I think initially we're like, well, this is going to be a 2-hour film about Garry. And then in the process, it just, I don't know if it ballooned, but I certainly, I was like, well, there's no way I can keep it under 2.5, and it's going to be a shitty 2.5 hours. Like, it's not really going to do the job that we need it to do. And so that's when we kind of opened up to the idea of doing a 2-parter.
The Zen Diaries of Garry Shandling. Mm-hmm. It's, I guess, at what point did you realize that it was going to be this, like, and I guess you could have just put out a 4.5 hour doc though, right? Or do you think that would just really turn people off? They're like, there's no way I'm going
to do it in one sitting?
Yeah.
I mean, you're asking a lot of people, and certainly you're asking HBO to program a 4.5 hour block for one film. That's tricky. And there's something fun about doing it and then having the cliffhanger and then coming back the next night, you know?
Yeah.
But, you know, in this day and age where people are banging out, you know, 8 hours in one sitting, and you have, you know, I would venture to say that Netflix insists on having, you know, more episodes than not. That if you're talking about that example, I think people are willing to kind of spend more time, regardless of how much they bitch about it, you know?
Right. Yeah, I think that there's that weird double-edged sword where people, sometimes what people say isn't always how they feel. And a lot of times they'll say like, oh, I don't have the time for it. And I think, but once somebody clicks play and once they sit down to watch something, it's a whole different story. Because even like sitting down to watch this one, it was like 2 hours. I was like, oh, that's really long. But then boom, you're in it. And then like credit to the editor, credit to the production and everything that goes into it. Yeah. If it's good, it'll pull you through and it doesn't matter how long it is.
Well, you know, I mean, I think in this case, it's kind of a nice immersive experience. And I mean, just from what I can glean from the responses, people get sucked in, they're sucked into his story. And perhaps that's just because he's a relatable figure. I think the reason that so many people were attracted to him, his friends, is that his struggle was right on the surface. And I think that's something you can connect to, you know.
Right, very relatable. I want to go more into detail with that, but like the whole. Sorry, I'm getting a little bit extra feedback here. Let me see here. Check. Give me one more check.
Check.
Cool. Yeah, it's like when I start to hear that echo, it's like shuts my brain down.
Is it the echo or the boom? The boominess?
I think it's more of like the bouncing off the. It's when they're not totally level, and I'm a little bit loud here, so.
Gotcha.
It's probably my fault. Check.
Check.
Cool. Can you hear yourself all right?
I can, yeah.
Okay, cool. I'm gonna cut this out.
That's all right. You know what?
Maybe that's what people want to see.
Gary would say, keep it all in.
Keep it all in.
This is the real shit.
Yeah, man. So I do want to talk more into detail about this film because I think it hits on, like when I watch it, I'm just like, oh shit, like how did you do that? How do you take all these interviews and make it compelling and kind of cover the same topics and the same ideas, but not beating it to death, where it's like I feel like you don't want to say the same thing twice, so each thing is subtly brought to you in a different way that seems like a different angle that you haven't seen before, goes a little bit deeper. But anyway, all that said, I'm going to hold that for later because it's the ground up show. It's really about your story and about how you got started. And I like to talk with people from like all different backgrounds, whether it's entrepreneurs or rappers or filmmakers, to see how they were able to like really get started and actually make a living in the creative arts, because it's, I think in a lot of ways, very scary to get into. I think now with like how the media is so fragmented, it's a little bit easier these days to like see a path where it may work for you, but at the same time, it's I think something that's challenging to get into. So when did you first start to take an interest in filmmaking?
That was probably in high school, at least. I mean, honestly, I remember I was 13 and my mother got me a video camera, and it kind of started there, you know.
Was it like a VHS? What do you
It was a VHS, yeah, like some Sharp camcorder back then. And that was the thing. I would just mess around and do goofy videos, and I would do in cuts, you know, in the camera, you know. So you just kind of like shoot and stop the camera and then flip it around and shoot. And so that was the editing that I was doing back then. So it started then, and then I was an AV kid in high school. And then, and that proceeded to college.
What did high school look like in terms of, and you know, what years are these? But then what did the programs look like? Was there editing classes?
No. So I went to LaGuardia High School, which is a performing arts high school, or the FAME school, if people remember that. So they had a little AV department. We would shoot the performances, that type of thing. And I remember there was a 3/4 deck system there that was, you know, not being used. And so I dusted that off. And so this is way before, or just at the precipice of computer editing. Like Avid had just started putting stuff out at that point. And what they did have were these giant optical discs. You know, they didn't use hard drives at all. It was very rudimentary at that point, you know.
And I think like at that time, it'd probably be even more challenging to see like, how is this going to work? Because you can't necessarily do everything yourself, and at least not at a high quality. Like shooting in a VHS tape and live editing is a little bit different than a full production and what people was capturing.
It is, but I mean, all that stuff is great training. And, you know, when Vine was still around, that's essentially what people were doing with Vine, what they were doing in-camera edits, you know, or if you're messing around with Instagram and doing that stuff, you know.
Right,
it's
like
the same thing.
The Instagram stories, it's like you have to be very thoughtful and intentional.
Yeah, and people are doing straight up TV shows with it now. You know, they're like cooking shows on Instagram stories, and they're great.
Wow.
You know?
And so then you take this to this kind of passion for filmmaking, and you knew that that's what you wanted to do in college?
It felt that way, yeah, or television or something like that. I never knew... And it seemed like I had always done some form of editing some way or another, you know, and it was the thing I was definitely interested in. When I graduated was kind of the height of the .com boom, the first one, I guess. And so a lot of people, myself included, kind of found ourselves getting sucked into that, you know. So my career as it stands right now was delayed a few years because I was doing that. And I kind of realized that I had lost my focus, if you want to call it that, and just quit and had to do a whole reset.
Did you start a company? Were you working with a startup?
I was working with a few. I think I started working at MTV. They had MTV Online. And then, you know, I mean, there was so much money and they were giving people so much money who didn't know what the fuck they were doing, myself included. So I was like an art designer and I was doing code, but I didn't really know how to do any of that stuff, but I was getting paid well, you know, which is the trap, I guess.
Right. And that's, I mean, you were only in it for a couple of years. Was it the .com boom, the crash that got you to rethink?
No, I quit but right before the crash.
Wow.
Yeah. And maybe I saw it happening. I doubt it. But I knew that I wasn't satisfied doing what I was doing. So I just kind of, you know, didn't work for 6 months and I had the luxury to do that. And then I just took a internship and started PAing at this little place that had an Avid in one of the rooms, and I started messing around with it.
I feel like it's not easy to say no to money, especially early on when you don't have any money and you're just starting out on a career path.
Yeah.
What was it about? Like, I guess what inspired you to actually be like, even a couple years in, be like, this isn't worth it? Was it like the work life crazy in terms of hours you're putting in, or it just wasn't connected to it?
I just wasn't creatively doing what I was supposed to do. You know, I really think that's what it comes down to. You know, if you're fortunate enough to have an idea of what you want to do with your life, then you can always have that as kind of your North Star and always position yourself in relation to that. So I'm sure if I was working at this place and I was able to kind of do online videos or explore that side of things, then I would have, you know, maybe stayed on a bit longer because I could say, well, this is pushing me towards the thing that I want to do.
Right. Like you kind of, now they would say you kind of create that side hustle first while you're working the full-time job. So then you might be able to transition out of it.
Yeah.
But then there was no opportunity like that around where you just had to,
which
in a way is good.
I mean, what we were talking about then, you know, there wasn't a ton of online video. It was very kind of, I think pseudo.com had just kind of was just around at that point, which people don't even know, you know, it was like Real Player was the stuff that we were using back then. So people can Google that if they want. Or there's a great film about pseudo.com called We Live in Public, which I recommend. It's a great doc, which is all about the insanity of that time.
And then, so at this point when you leave your job, what was the dream? You know, what was the, like, if I could do this for a living, that would be enough?
I don't know if I knew. I just felt like editing was the best way to learn. I had a few experiences when I was in college and I was PAing and working at some places where I'd be on set and they would say, here, I mean, I literally remember this one time where the key PA or whatever you call it, had me guarding a traffic cone, and that was my job. And I mean, I think at that point I realized that was not something that, you know, I was not going to learn if I was going to be on set. It's not going to happen. And, you know, my experience editing has kind of borne that out. I learned much more just being in this weird room and looking at the footage. I learned so much about all aspects of the production and not just being on set, you know? And other experiences, like I remember I was a PA on they were shooting a trailer, and I thought the DP was amazing, and he seemed so on it. And then when he saw the footage, it looked like shit, you know? And that's the thing. It's all about what the result is, you know?
So you saw this DP that was like, in the moment, he had his shit together, but then it didn't translate to an actually good product.
Yeah, it was terrible, you know? So, I mean, you can be on set, and certainly you can learn things, you know? Of course you can. But you can learn those same things in the edit room, and even more so, I think. Mm-hmm. And also you're learning about storytelling, which it's hard to get a sense of that on the set.
Did it start out with smaller projects?
Yeah.
Like shorter cuts?
I was doing EPKs, which were like press kits for Britney Spears and NSYNC and people like that. So I was doing a lot of that. And then concurrently, I was doing a lot of news pieces, like that were funded by the UN or different organizations like that would air on CNN.
Mm-hmm. And that like gives you some grounding like in how to actually edit and like, you know, the quickness, the shortcuts, all that stuff. And that's probably like the best way to learn that stuff is just doing small projects beginning to end. It's almost like a microcosm of what a longer form project might be.
Well, especially that stuff, because you have to do all the finishing work. So you're doing the color correcting, you're doing the sound work, but you're learning how to do, I mean, one of the reasons that I'm good at music editing now is because of that EPK work I was doing. And, you know, and just learning how to chop it up and do music edits, which is a real skill and not terribly easy for a lot of people.
What's challenging about doing a music edit, and what do you mean exactly? Is that like the EPK where you're cutting to a song, or
you know, I'm making a song that's 3 minutes. I just want it to last for 45 seconds, you know, and you have to find a way to chop it up.
Oh, the magic of taking that final sting and then bringing it up a little bit closer.
Exactly, or looping something, you know, and that comes into play all the time.
Do you work with what is it called, the full stems a lot? Do you do a lot of the music editing these days, or is it?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And then are you working with like all the stems, like each instrument as you're going through, or?
I mean, it depends. Yeah. If you have access to that stuff, you know, the Shandling thing, that was the first time I had access to a music editor, you know, but generally in the offline, I'm doing all the music editing, and it was nice having a music editor because we could play with the stems and kind of increase the levels of a particular instrument, that type of thing, you know?
Yeah. Is there much of a difference between when you're just doing it solo by yourself and you're doing everything yourself versus then when you have to scale up to a team and then you have to, in many ways, learn how to direct and tell people what you want, which isn't always the most straightforward thing to do?
I think that, I mean, it's challenging. I certainly enjoy being in the mix. But there's this aspect where the whole thing is a marathon, you know what I mean? And you just have to keep pushing at every point. And when you get to a stage like the mix or the online, you know, you're so exhausted from the experience that you run the risk of kind of letting go a little bit. And these aren't, in some cases, people who are not necessarily like married to the project, or, you know, they're not living and dying it, you know what I mean? And so you have to be that person that's doing that, and sometimes you have to push and potentially be an asshole, which is, you know, I'm not terribly comfortable doing that. Mm-hmm. But if you have to do it, you just keep pushing.
How do you achieve that art of telling people what you want, and especially because it's easy if they just listen to you, but when they start pushing back, then you're like, nah.
Well, on the Garry thing, it's easy because it's like, this is the way Judd wants it, like this.
Yeah,
you know. So
just do that. That's, I think, probably the importance of that relationship between the editor and the director, right? Where then there's a trust there, because at the end of the day, whatever the director wants is the way it's gonna play out.
Exactly.
So was there a first project that was truly intimidating? You know, I'm sure, like, obviously maybe the first EPKs were a little bit challenging just because it's something new, but then when you're stepping up to the next level, doing something longer form, what was the first project that was like long format? This is intimidating. Where do I start?
There's certainly, you know, a lot of cases where I come in and I'm a little scared, which I think is a good thing. You know, that generally means that you're out of your comfort zone and you're pushing yourself. which I think you should probably endeavor to do that with every project. You know what I mean? I don't know. I was doing EPKs and these news things, and I decided that I needed to push myself. And this is very early on. And so I did one of those A&E biographies, if you remember those shows. And that's probably the first long form thing I did.
And how do you approach it? Like how, and you say starting out any long form documentary, like what's the first step? Like, what do you do when you're looking at?
Well, if you're talking about documentary, I mean, that I wouldn't qualify that as a documentary.
Okay.
You know?
So that's primarily what you do now, right? Is cut documentaries. When did that transition start? When did you like start to find that niche?
That really came off of, well, I had done some, news things that I guess ostensibly were documentaries, but not in the same, it was kind of journalism. It's not in the same vein of the type of thing I'm trying to do now. So when I did This American Life, they had a TV show. And I had been I was in a place and they were doing reality stuff, and I heard that they got that project, which was huge. And I told them I wanted to do it. And so I pushed to get on that show, and I did. And that was kind of the turning point for me.
Why was it a turning point?
It was because I was doing the kind of work I wanted to do. And I was working with the kind of people I wanted to work with. People who were, real storytellers, you know what I mean? And I feel like, that was an exciting show at the time. I think it had, not a ton of people watched it, but it had a lot of impact at the time, just creatively, and, people who were in that creative world.
Well, I feel like what you were saying before was like, it's a marathon and you just got to keep pushing through. At the same time, you can only push through if you really care about it. Like, if you don't like running marathons, then you're going to have a terrible time and you're probably going to give up. And most projects that get started aren't finished. Most people that attempt to, say, create their first feature doc, most of the time they don't complete it.
Yeah.
How important was it for you to find work that was fulfilling? And also, like, how did you define what that meant? Like, what excited you about, like, This American Life and those kind of projects?
I guess first and foremost, like, you want to do something that you feel like you don't have to apologize for afterwards, And so I was doing these reality things, which was great training for me because you're cutting scenes and you're trying to make the footage do things that it doesn't want to do, and you're just getting better. But I felt like I had done what I wanted to do in that, and I had learned what I was going to learn from that stuff. And when This American Life came around, that is a perfect example. It's like, this is worthwhile. It's not disposable television. And there's certainly a place for reality stuff. I'm not shitting on it. People get a lot of enjoyment from it, and a lot of good people work on that stuff, but it wasn't for me,
Yeah, dude, honestly, like, my girlfriend, she's big into The Bachelor. And that's it. And like, since she's Australian, she's got the Australian version and the American version. It's a problem. But sometimes I'll watch it with her and I'm like, first of all, hat tip to the producers and the filmmakers, everybody that works on those shows. Like, there are some truly talented individuals.
I don't hate on that show. My wife makes me watch it sometimes. And, and you realize very quickly, they hate everybody who's on the show and they're making fun of them, and they seem to be having fun with it. So, yeah, that's not... That show's fine.
Right. They get a pass. No, it's so bizarre, though, because then you watch, like, the final 3 episodes, and it's the same conversation over and over and over again. Like I don't know. Do I love her? Do I love her? I don't know. I don't know. And just the way that they cut it and they tie it together, and I'm like... I mean, maybe me coming from having a background of editing and filmmaking, I see it more than Natalie does, but I'm like just in awe at how they're able to keep the story going, right? And I think that's you may disagree, but I think that's like when you're not working with anything, when you're not working with material, like that's the hardest thing, to be like, how do we just keep this thing going and stretch it out?
Yeah, I guess so. Well, you have some like rando boyfriend come in and you tease it for 8 weeks, apparently.
Right. Yeah, that's the... I mean, I totally see that, but that's more on the, I don't know. The whole thing is like popcorn, right? It's not like...
I stand to my death that The Bachelor this year was garbage. It was bad casting. That guy was lame.
It was bad from the beginning. Now I
can't believe I was forced to watch it.
You know, it's funny. This episode, this is gonna turn into just a Bachelor breakdown.
Yeah, let's not do that.
Yeah.
No offense, but I think there are better podcasts for that.
To each their own. As long as you're enjoying the work you're doing, and it's adding value, and people are enjoying
feeding your family.
Right. I mean, that's the thing we didn't really talk about, but like that's an important part of it.
Yeah.
And the transition to this, like to be able to tie This American Life where you actually get paid to do something you really love is like an amazing connection. But before that was working on projects and probably like an element of finding where you are and finding what you want to do, but also making money.
Yeah.
And how, like, does that factor into your decision making these days, or is it like a delicate balance between the two? Between, do I love this project? Is there a budget?
I want a budget because you want resources to do the things you want to do, and it just so stands, there's a lot of archival, there are things like that. So there has to be, if I'm doing an archival based film, it's probably going to have a sizable budget,
Right. The archival stuff is expensive.
Yeah.
And is that for is it archivist? Archivalist, the person who gets the footage, who finds it, and the researcher.
Yeah.
Is that where a lot of the money is, or is it the actual purchasing of this?
It's the licensing. That's where the money is. Yeah.
Oh, it's so expensive.
Yeah. Well, at least on the Garry thing, Judd had relationships with so many people that, it wasn't as cumbersome for us, I think.
Right.
But like music is a thing that will just get you,
yeah, especially if you're using like a well-known song.
Yeah.
That's it. Are these things that you have to worry about as an editor?
Yeah. I mean, to my point about kind of learning all facets, like if you're dealing with archival, you're constantly thinking about how much does this photo cost? And do I have a photo that's similar that, that's just an example, but you are thinking about it.
Right. What happened after This American Life and your transition into more docu style?
I think after This American Life, that's when I said, well, this is the type of thing I want to do. Mm-hmm. And I was pretty, cemented in that. So I was trying to do documentaries off of that experience. Mm-hmm. And so I did a film called Objectified, which was done by Gary Hustwit. He did Helvetica and he did Urbanized.
Did you feel going into, was that one of your bigger films early on?
That's the first feature documentary I did. Yeah. And by the way, This American Life is very good. People should watch it. The episode John Smith is like, I feel like that's easily one of the best things I've done.
Well, I'll have to check that out.
It's great.
So Objectified.
I'm just going to suck myself off.
Yeah, please go for it. The Objectified was, I did a documentary on design called Design Disruptors, which was like about the product design today, how like Facebook, Twitter, Airbnb, they're all designing experiences on the mobile. Challenging topics to cover, like design and making that interesting, but then also like having a story. Like how did that film specifically, how did you approach it? How did you create, how did you know what the center of the story was?
That one was really tricky because if you want to compare it to something like Helvetica started with like, I'm going to tell a film about this very specific little thing, which is this font, and then I'm going to blow up from that. But if you're doing a film about industrial design, that encompasses everything. If it's about chairs and it's also about cars and it's also about abstract design, that's kind of a very bloated subject. So I think the trick was trying to create an arc where you started with the small, where you start with a chair essentially, and then you go to larger concepts where people are doing experimental stuff with robots, but it's still considered industrial design.
With any documentary, with Objectified, but really any film, like, is it scene by scene? Do you start with like, okay, this is how the film's going to open up, and that's how I start cutting?
No, oftentimes you don't know what the opening or ending of the film is going to be. I think you need to. My process is I screen everything, and then you start to lock in on little things, And that film is different than an archival film where, you're really trying to figure out how do you take all these disparate things and tell a cohesive story, But the films that are about ideas rather than characters are particularly tricky, because you're trying to create an emotional response, and finding ways to do that with, when people are just speaking in the abstract, that can be really tricky. Do
you, I guess at the same time, you kind of want characters in a way. Like you want people that have personality, that are a little bit quirky, that are a little bit interesting. Oftentimes when you get, like, say, a lot of these docs are interview heavy, talking head heavy. How often might you have an interview where you're like, oh, I don't think there's going to be anything in this one. Like, I don't think I can use any of this interview.
I mean, that happens, and then you just don't use it.
Yeah.
You know?
How many interviews, like, on average, do you generally need? I guess that's probably a tough question, but, like, for one doc I did, we did 20 interviews, and another one there was, like, it was crazy. It was like 60 or something like that, because we interviewed like 5 people at each company. It was just madness.
Yeah.
What does it look like for you? And yeah, is there a sweet spot?
I mean, you know, my ideal is that you don't have interviews at all, you know. With the Garry film, that it was not going to be that way, you know. And so if we're using that as an example, I think the key is you want people to speak about authority, about the thing. Like, I'm not going to have Kevin Nealon talking about Gary's childhood because he wasn't there and he doesn't know what he's talking about, you know. And it would just be kind of secondhand information. So that's why the cousin's speaking about it, because he was there. So along the way, you're trying to, the people that you have speaking, they're speaking from a place of authority, you know, and you're trying to be as concise as humanly possible, you know, and if there's any sign of repetition, you have to kill it.
Right, and that's what we were talking about with the Garry Shandling doc too, is because there's themes like finding yourself, being your true self, and, you know, comedy, challenge yourself, and also like switching your path, and there's just so many elements that might come back into it that tie back to a previous idea, but it wasn't quite the same thing. And like how, so this is a 2.5 hour, say like the first one is 2.5 hours, the whole thing is 4.5 or 2 hours for the first one. How long is it? Like the rough cut. How long was the rough cut? Because you have to start kind of trimming down, or is it this?
I mean, honestly, I don't think. I'm trying to think. I don't think our first rough cut was dramatically different. I mean, it's certainly different, and we moved some stuff around as we got notes and feedback from people. But although people were kind of very positive after that first pass, I generally don't have bloated cuts for some reason, and maybe that's just because I'm like maniacal about it, and I'm trying to make a very tight cut on my first pass. Like, I don't want to give, it's almost like I don't want to give people the opportunity to tear it apart, you know? And I'm trying to express all my ideas as quickly as possible in that first pass. Because once, you know, after I do the first pass, I kind of lose control of putting my voice into it, if that makes sense. That was not the case with Judd, by the way. It does happen in other cases, you know?
No, I people start to get married to what that first cut is, whether
well, no, not that, but they're like, you know, the first pass feels like that's where I have solo authorship to some degree. Of course, you're having conversations, you know, but it's like I'm trying to put all my ideas in there, and I won't get all of them because it's you know, it's a fluid thing, and you get new ideas. Certainly after you get reactions, that type of thing. But, you know, I'm trying to get my expression out. And once you get first beyond that, then you kind of say, okay, I did what I thought works. And then you get into a reactive state where you're trying to address other people's comments, you know?
Right. It's almost like that original cut is the purest form of what you're going to be able to create.
Or the shittiest form,
you know,
form. And then
it could
you just
happen.
got to go back, you know. But yeah.
So like working with Judd Apatow on this one, are you in constant contact? Is he in the room? Are we just saying like have a couple conversations up front, and then let's see what this first pass looks like?
Yeah, I mean, you know, I think initially it wasn't placed anywhere, and it was kind of a germ of an idea. And he called me and he said, "I'm doing this thing," and I said, "Okay, well." Let's look at the footage and see if there's a thing, you know? And I did, and I said, yes, there's definitely something. And I had not even seen journals or anything like that at that point. And that only came a little bit later that he started feeding me some of that stuff. So I think the first thing I did was I kind of did a proof of concept, like the first 8 minutes, which was the childhood essentially. And I think based off of that, we said, it seemed like we were in line aesthetically in terms of how we wanted to tell the story. And that gave us a good footing to proceed and keep pushing forward.
Was that all, when you said you looked at all the footage, was that the interviews that were already done? Or was
No, those kept coming along during the process. And even archival, a lot of the Larry Sanders stuff, all those dailies that we found, that came later in the process. So it was kind of an interesting process where archival will come and then I would just recut, and keep working in layers. And same with interviews. We would say, well, we need somebody to speak a bit more about this,
Mm-hmm. Are there moments that are serendipitous where you're like, somebody talks about a joke and then you're like, oh, I know where that joke is? Or like you happen to find that joke being said?
Yeah, there's tons of that. A real focus in terms of telling the jokes, you wanted it to be autobiographical, and there's a lot of that stuff in Garry. So, like he tells the joke about his mother flying in and he's doing this. It's like, okay, well, that's going to go into that sequence where you're kind of revisiting this idea of the overbearing mother, who's suffocating him, And there are a lot of little gems like that. There's a great one during It's Garry Shandling Show where he's riffing on a jog joke, this weird thing. And then he tells the audience that he's about to host the Tonight Show in a few days. And that was a transition point to launch us into this whole Tonight Show Garry Shandling sequence,
Right.
So you're always looking for organic ways to kind of make these transitions happen, or convey information.
Right. And it's more so, I guess, just being open to catching those. And, because obviously you may have at least broad strokes idea, well, we want to go from this to this. This is just how his path and his life goes.
Yeah.
And then to be able to find those moments where you're like, holy shit, like that is an amazing transition.
Well, just to and to let things naturally unfold. Like, I'm trying to cut as much as humanly possible without the benefit of a talking head or somebody telling you what to think. I think the reason, at least based on what I've heard, that people really respond to the film and the journals and stuff is because when you're reading the journals, you're in your own head, you're internalizing it. I think it's the same experience with the Cobain film where you're kind of in your head, you're saying those words in your head, you're having a visceral experience with the material. But in terms of like being open to things, that's a constant. I think a mistake that a lot of people make is they say the film is this, and then the film is going to tell you what it wants to be, at a certain point, and you can't try and force it, or force this idea that you had on day one if on day 20 it really wants to be something else. I've had a lot of experiences. Even Ira Glass on This American Life, we had this story about a boy who's kind of trapped in his body. He has complete like muscular atrophy, and initially the idea was that it was going to be like this little 10-minute vignette, and it was going to be about this kid who's on the precipice of death all the time. But part of the story was that he had a girlfriend, and his girlfriend broke up with him because he lived at home with his mom. And so I think once we keyed on that, that's a much more human story, but you have to be open to kind of changing midstream and allowing that to happen.
Is it oftentimes that you're finding the film and specifically a documentary, or is it all the time that you're finding it in post-production? Like that's where the story comes out, or sometimes does it evolve in the actual capturing of the film?
Well, when you're doing an archival film, yeah, everything is happening in post. Mm-hmm. It's not like you're out there and the story's unfolding before your eyes as you're shooting it. You're not filming a primary or something like that. So there's a different discipline and there's a lot more work. If you're shooting something and you're doing a verite film, you constantly have to have an idea of what the film is, and and that's what you're pursuing. Things can obviously change in the edit, but you have to figure out what you're going to shoot and what's more important, that type of thing,
Did you, I think you said that you don't prefer to do all talking head. Would you prefer a verite film? Like, is that more interesting to you?
No, I like the archival films.
Yeah.
It's much, much harder. But I enjoy verite as well, Mm-hmm. So it all depends. I mean, I think it's really the subject matter. There's something nice about telling these stories about these icons, and really getting into their creative process. And I don't know, sometimes it's just that's the project that comes to me and it's the best project at the time. And so I'm going to go after it.
Right. With the Garry Shandling doc, are there things about his story that connected with you and you felt resonated with your own story or journey?
Yeah, for sure. I think if you're a creative person, I think it connects with any creative person. I'd be shocked if it didn't, because he's dealing with the same kind of self-doubts and the same, but I mean, with Garry, this idea of kind of constantly digging for truth is something I certainly connected with. This idea of never wanting to repeat yourself, and constantly pushing yourself is something I connected with. And beyond that, just try not to be an asshole,
Right.
Certainly I connect with,
Yeah.
or I try to,
Yeah, he. It was amazing to see, and just the way it's put together is you see the inner workings of his mind while he's having these amazing accomplishments, where from the outside people just see, and that's one of the reasons why I like doing this podcast, is because then we get to just kind of talk about what's going on underneath and behind the scenes, because you see a final film and then everything seems obvious, or you see somebody hosting a late night show and you're like, wow, they were born for this. But then to be able to see him sketching in his notes over and over again, like encouraging himself to keep going, to be yourself, and like, where in a way it's like, it's sad in a way, but it's so real that like, these are things you're always going to be dealing with and you're going to be struggling with. And they're kind of, sometimes they may fade, but all in all, you're going to be facing these if you keep pushing yourself.
Yeah.
With the journals, when you're talking about letting them speak for themselves, like how did you go about that specific decision? Because like, I don't think that's intuitive to just say like, all right, we're just going to have people, and like for a good...
To not have people read them?
Yeah, to have people read them and not have... Some of them, there were voiceovers. I think it was like Michael Cera doing voiceover for some of them, and then some of them, there was no voiceover.
I mean, I remember initially I was like, well, we're never going to have any voiceover. And I think it was Judd's idea to do the Michael Cera thing. And that was a very inspired decision because you have so much fun with that, But I will say that the journals that Michael Cera's that he's reading, for the most part, with the exception of the last one, they're kind of very surface, and it's kind of do this. I'm doing great. I'm traveling here. So that was kind of almost for pace and excitement in a section where we didn't have a ton of archival, and it just had to be layered and fun. So that, I think that was the motivation for a lot of that, because his VO is not covering a ton of the film, if you think about it.
No, it was noticeable to me just because I'd seen that you had not used it in certain portions, and I was curious about that. But that is an interesting point.
And when you get very intimate, it didn't feel right.
Right.
Yeah,
if it was something that was a really deep thought or something that was profound, like...
Yeah, I mean, if it's like fear of death or something like that, it didn't feel right.
Yeah.
But somehow with the Barry letter at the very end, and if people see this, then they'll know what I'm talking about, or you can step away for 4.5 hours and we'll be here when you come back.
Right.
Yeah, with that one, that felt right.
Uh-huh.
And he did a great read on all that stuff.
Yeah. What is you're dealing with massive amounts of footage. Like, how many hours of broad strokes, like interviews and archival footage are you going through? And the big question for me is, how do you keep it all organized? Like, what does that system look like?
Well, on the Garry thing, I remember at some point I asked my AE to kind of like just give us an idea, and I think we had, and this is not counting the Larry Sanders Show or any of the shows. I think it was around 300 hours. My process is just I pull selects, and I have selects reels, and I try and break those down as much as possible. So as I'm screening, I'm making selects. And then when I start cutting, then if I go into a scene, I'm saying I'm going to be accessing this material. I pare it down. I create kind of a second sequence, which is a pared down sequence. So you're just whittling it down and you push forward. But the nice thing about the sequences is you can just toggle through it very quickly. You know,
What do you mean?
I'm just going to the next edit. So I'm bap, 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 bap.
Okay.
I know people use markers that for me, I really don't like those. And I don't like to use them. For one, because I don't want to have 7,000 bins open. And I don't want to do a lot of clicking. But also it doesn't feel as streamlined to me, you know?
Is it like when you're creating these selects, is it like time era for a certain show that he's on? How do you organize
Yeah,
those?
I mean, it would be, you know, it's Garry Shandling show selects, or childhood selects, Super 8 childhood selects, you know. And I'm trying to break it down as cleanly as possible so that you can access it quickly, you know what it is, and you don't have to do a lot of guesswork, you know.
And are you doing, when you're going through and where it's not just B-roll, where it may be, you know, you need to be listening, are you doing 2 times speed when you're playing it back, or is it
Sometimes, yeah.
speed?
A lot of the time.
Yeah. And then this is Premiere?
This is Avid.
Avid? Okay.
Yeah.
Is that standard for most
For most
projects
docs,
like this?
I know. I mean, if we were to, you know, if you want to get into that stuff, I understand that people use it for narrative films, and I think that there's a manageable amount of material when you're doing those. And certainly for shorter projects, it's great, especially if you're doing, you know, stuff that has a lot of graphics in it. Then it's a great tool. I don't think for certainly someone like Garry, I think it would have been a nightmare.
Really?
Yeah.
What's the difference? I guess from a layman, from somebody who, I mean, I don't know anything about Avid. I've never used it. So actually, I did try to, like, they teach it in college.
Yeah.
And then you try, and then I was like, it's not working out. Like, I was using,
you know, honestly, the fundamentals of it are just like anything else. Especially if you map your keyboard, there's no, I can move from one to the other pretty cleanly because, I don't know. I remember one of the first things I did, and this was from watching another editor, who actually, this is Wyatt Smith, and he's now doing a bunch of Marvel stuff, like he did Doctor Strange, but he happened to be kind of doing some press stuff when I was working out of this same little office, and I remember looking at his settings, and I was like, oh, I'm going to steal that, because he had no buttons, and everything was the keyboard. So that's one of the things I definitely jumped on really quickly, just to get fast, you know, and take off the training wheels.
So that was a process. That was like, I'm going to learn these shortcuts.
Yeah, well, you just map it, and through memorization, pretty quickly you've got it down. You know?
But I feel like it has to be very intentional to make that decision. Because like I know primary shortcuts, but like I couldn't just edit all keyboard. That's like another level.
I recommend it, you know, especially if you have a client behind you and you're sitting there like click, 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 they're going to fucking bash your head in. You know, speed is, you want to, I don't know, I endeavor to try and move as speeded, you know, at the speed of thought almost, you know, like if I have an idea, I want to be able to execute it very quickly, you know. When I'm trying to grapple with structure and stuff like that, obviously it's not that fast, and I'm just standing, staring at a wall and trying to figure out how I want to do something. But if I know what I want to do and where I want to go with it, I can chop up a bite really fast, you know, because I'm just executing.
I think like that is hugely important but without the storytelling ability, like if an editor was dependent upon a director to cue every edit or every scene and you know, edit for them, it wouldn't work, right? Like it would just be too cumbersome, where like you have to have that storytelling in you.
Well, I think with docs, it's necessary. Like you're basically a storyteller in the room. And, you know, you should be. I mean, that's the fun of it. You don't want to be sitting there waiting for somebody to tell you what button to press. You know what I mean? Then you're just pressing buttons and you're not a filmmaker.
What do you think is the biggest mistake that like young filmmakers make or inexperienced editors make when telling a long project?
Oh God, I don't know.
Like when you're watching a film, what stands out to you where you're like maybe I would have done it differently, or maybe like they just totally lost the plot?
I mean, that happens all the time. The fact of the matter is that storytelling is really, really hard, and people do not say that enough. You know, I don't care who it is. You know, if it's Judd or if it's Ira or if it's anybody I work with, at some point you're in the room and you're just sitting there like this and you're like, I don't know how to solve this thing. You know what I mean? And that happens all the time. And I think the difference is that the good people just keep fighting through it. You know, like you need to know what's good enough. That's the hard part. And it takes a long time. You have to do a lot of shitty work before you get good enough, you know? It's just about getting your reps in, you know? The first jump shot LeBron ever made probably clanged off the top of, you know, the clock, you know what I mean? But he kept shooting. This is a stupid...
No, I think that's great, dude.
You know what I'm saying?
Inspired.
You just have to put your reps in.
Yeah, I mean, well, that's the thing,
and you have to work.
Yeah,
you know what I mean. And you have to be hungry. And you just have to ask for opportunities.
Right. Nobody's going to do it for you.
Yeah, and it's really hard for AEs now because you are just loading, you know, and doing tasks, and it's not like it used to be where you shared the room and you were kind of actively helping the editor. And I don't really know a solution for that other than to say, give me a scene, I want to try this, you know, and ask questions, you know? Mm-hmm. That's really what it comes down to.
A lot of people, a lot of creatives, entrepreneurs that would say, don't be a perfectionist. But I think the beauty is in trying to find that balance where, like, you are a perfectionist in so many ways. Because, like, if you weren't a perfectionist, if you really didn't want to get the story right and just kill it and knock it out of the park, then I don't think you're going to deliver your best work.
Yeah. Well, that's what deadlines are for.
Right.
You know, like at a certain point, it's got to be done. You know what I mean? But until you have to hand it over, you just go crazy trying to make it, just like pull every drop of blood out of that thing that you can, you know?
Producers and directors, how do we know how to set appropriate deadlines? How long are some of these films that you're working on? Like, how long are you in post on them?
It's interesting because, you know, we talked about length and stuff like that. Like Jane is a 90-minute film. You know, all told, that process was like 2 years, you know. And I myself, like I towards the very end of the process, we kind of finished the film, but there were a couple scenes that needed to be massaged, and I had to leave to have a baby, you know, so that process continued, and the finishing on that film was extensive, you know, if you just think about the sound work and all of that. So anyway, that's a 90-minute film, took all that time. Garry is 4.5 hours, and we cut that in under a year, you know, so every situation is different.
What, like when you're talking about some of the talking head documentaries, what's a unique challenge to that and making that interesting versus the verite stuff?
Well, I mean, you can have talking heads in verite films.
Sure.
They do all the time. I think, you know, the danger of talking heads is that they can become, they're overwhelmed. The film is overwhelmed by the talking heads, you know, and it's really about having specificity. And, you know, there are these films where you're setting up a subject, and I'm sure there are a million cases of this, and they always have this opening sequence where you're introducing people to this character. You know, let's say it's Kennedy, it's JFK, and you have these generic comments where JFK was really the greatest man of his generation, and it's coming from, I don't know, Eddie Izzard or some shit like that. Like that's an example of a bad use of talking heads for me, you know, where it's some person talking about how this great icon affected them, but it's not from a personal place. They didn't know them. They can't speak with authority about that person. I'm not getting to know this person through this talking head's comments, you know?
Right. Like you have to, like you said before, have the person speak from authority. Like that person needs to be
an intimate, you know?
Right.
As best as possible. You know, in the Garry thing, I mean, there are cases where they aren't necessary. Like Conan talks about it's Garry Shandling show, but then he had this very close relationship with Garry, you know, at a pivotal point, you know? So I feel like he can speak from a place of authority. I think everybody in that film can.
Sure.
You know?
Yeah. Like there's probably some people that can overlap with that, but then there's going to be, it's just going to, I guess the idea is going to land stronger. There's going to be more of an emotional connection to that story when it's being told from somebody, like you said, that's in an intimate place to be able to speak from that.
Yeah. I mean, I think one of the big challenges when you're entering a film is just discovering like whose voice is it, you know, and what's the voice that's telling this story, you know? And in some cases, it's you could say, well, I'm just going to use Garry's voice and he's going to tell the whole story and I'm not going to have anybody else talk. Or you say, well, you know, I don't know. It's just we're going to jumble this stuff together and do the best we can, you know?
Are there any other, so you talk about like speaking from authority, are there anything else that stands out to you that is just critical for you when you're telling a story, and certain things that you have to keep top of mind? Or like, I guess it's almost like an unwritten rule. It's like a rule that can be bent. It's not like you have to do that. But are there other things like that come to mind that help you through the editing process?
The only thing, I'm just trying to find, the thing I'm trying to do is find the most interesting solution for a problem. And I'm trying to create a scenario where the audience is doing as much work as possible, you know? Like I have little hard rules, like I don't use dissolves. I don't believe in dissolves.
Yeah, me too.
Visual dissolves, I mean.
Yeah.
Like I remember when I was in AE and I was in the room with some other editor, and it was like a History Channel show, which, you know, whatever. And it was right at the end of the project, right? They were about to, you know, spit out the cut. And she was like, well, let me clean up these edits and just like dissolve. And then she said, her phrase was, some editor told her, said, if there's a cut you can't resolve, dissolve.
Oh my God.
And I immediately said, well, I'm never going to do that, because that's absolute bullshit.
Yeah.
You know, I don't think there's a cut you can't make. You can always find a way to make it work.
Yeah.
You know? And I think, you know, in terms of taking off the training wheels, like that's another thing that I had done early on. I was, you know, I'm going to make these cuts work. And you find tricks to do that.
Right. I love those ideas, though, too, that it simplifies everything. Because you don't need to add fancy transitions. You know what I mean? If you can just do a straight cut for everything, that's just so many other decisions that you don't have to make. You don't have to think, well, I'm going to fade to black here, and then I'm going to fade up, and then.
Well, listen, you know, part of the reason for that is that a dissolve is telling the audience what's happening before it's happening, you know, and you're stripping their ability to kind of do the work. You know what I mean? A dissolve says, okay, we're transitioning to something else. And I would much prefer, and I feel like an edit is truth. You know what I mean? I'm doing an edit and I'm cutting from this to this, and in your mind, you're making the connection and you're doing the time travel, you know?
You said you want to make the audience work. I feel like that's like counterintuitive, where I feel like you would want to hold the audience's hand and take them on the story.
You don't want the audience to be confused, but you never want to hold their hand. You know, especially now, like people are watching Game of Thrones and you're dealing with like 100 storylines and you're expected to remember something from season 1 and how it impacts season 5. I mean, audiences are very sophisticated. You don't have to do a lot. You don't have to hold their hands. You don't want them to be sitting around confused and saying, I don't understand what's going on, you know? But no, I think in the Garry thing, I think the reason it's rewarding is because people are doing the work. You know, you're reading those journals and you're making connections. And so when you are at the end and you're getting that letter, there's a huge payoff, I hope. And I think people are emotionally affected because, for one, you've lived his entire life. Like a case in point is at the very end in the credit sequence, we have footage of the memorial, and Kevin Nealon is telling jokes related to Garry and related to this film that you've seen. And he tells that Pelicano joke. And I feel like it's you know, people laugh and they think it's hysterical and they have this cathartic experience, but it's only because you've lived his life with him, you know, and you've had the experience and you've made those connections, you know. That's the only reason that joke works.
How do you make sure you don't hold the audience's hand? Like, how do you give enough away that you're guiding them on a story without revealing too much, and while like also like saving stuff for later?
I think yeah, I mean, that's part of the way that you're laying things out. You know, I think if you think about it in narrative terms, it's just like a big slow reveal. You know, like how do you enter a scene? Do you enter in a master shot where you can see everything at once, or are you starting on this little thing and you're constantly saying, what is that? What's happening? What's happening? You know, like ideally, even in these docs, I'm trying to, when I enter a scene, I think initially you should say, where am I? What's happening? And then it reveals itself to you, you know, and that's the kind of thing where I'm talking about doing the work, even in these edits. And the reason you want that is because the accumulation of it's like little rewards, you know, and you're constantly being rewarded for being an attentive viewer, you know?
Right. Like if you stop paying attention for a minute, if you take your eyes off the screen, you might miss something that's going to be necessary.
necessary, or, you know, if you miss it, it won't ruin your experience, but you'd have a richer experience if you paid attention.
Right.
You know,
what advice would you give directors, filmmakers, camera operators that are going out in the field, starting a documentary of their own? Like, what are practical advice that any editor would thank them for?
Well, one of the best shooters I ever worked with, or early on, he was a great shooter, and he came from a news background, and he was expected to cut his own pieces. And he was a really good shooter as a result, because he knew the pitfalls of things he would do. You know, he knew how to cover a scene. He knew how to hold his shots so he could tell a story. And I think a lot of people don't have the experience of cutting their own footage. I would definitely recommend that. You know, you will become instantly better because you will know all the mistakes. Mm-hmm. I think most editors would say count to 10, you know what I mean? And get coverage, mm-hmm. you know, and get good sound. People always mess that up if we're talking about practical things.
Yeah, those two things by themselves. I think you're right with when I first started shooting and editing, it's like you're just yelling at yourself in the editing room. You're like, why am I zooming?
Yeah.
Why am I zooming now? Like you settle in on a shot and then you pull back and zoom and then move it all around.
Oh yeah. If I was talking to shooters, I would say, you know what? Because you can watch footage and the footage is an expression of the person that's shooting it, you know? It's like, whoa, that dude is having a bad day because he's so skittish, you know? Like I know I've seen footage and it's just crazy and it constantly moves. And then I meet the person and it's like, oh, this guy is jumping around like he just did a pound of crack, you know?
Right.
So I don't know, meditate, you know, if you're a shooter, it would help, you know, just to like be present and feel the scene, you know, mm-hmm. and just chill out.
Mm-hmm. Take your time with it.
Yeah.
Yeah. And make sure you have enough time for B-roll, right? Don't just run in there, shoot the interview and get out. Make sure you can actually establish a scene.
Yeah, exactly.
How about interviews and interviewing? Mm-hmm. What are some things that you see in watching full interviews, unedited? What can you tell about what makes a good interview?
It depends, you know. I mean, that's another case where, I don't know. It's, I think one thing is to like not make yourself the subject of the interview. You know, ask questions, allow people to respond. Don't jump all over them. You know, the stuff in the Shandling film is very different because those are conversations. They're not interviews per se. It's about the back and forth, and we embrace that, you know. Mm-hmm. If I had to use it as just a strictly talking head, it would have been complicated, you know, because Judd is, you know, having a conversation with people. So, but in terms of straight talking heads, I think it's really just allowing that person to respond. And, you know, there's this thing that Garry said that I also connected with where he kind of emphasized the importance of silence, you know, and I think that that's an important thing. I just in myself, when I've done interviews with people, just the act of like not coaxing another comment from them and allowing them to sit in an uncomfortable silence, something will come out. They'll open up to fill that silence with something that you would never expect. And that's kind of a rich, you know, that's something that I at least I personally experience. I've seen it sometimes, you know, but, you know, some people are just really good at interviews, you know. Mm-hmm. Ira Glass is really good. When Brett was interviewing Jane Goodall, they kind of had a little bit of a contentious relationship initially, and that kind of bore a lot of fruit. It was kind of a fun interview because of that, and I think it brought out a side of her that you don't see a lot, you know. So it just depends on the situation.
I think I'm supposed to leave a long silence after the end of that comment.
Yeah, and then I'll tell you about my childhood.
Yeah.
You know?
It all began. When you're editing, I know for me when I first started, and sometimes I fall into it just because it's like the details and the fine touches and the polish is like what's sometimes fun to work on because it's a little bit mindless. It's just easy. You can kind of tweak sound effects and transitions and all this stuff, and it's really easy. Do you focus on any of that polish up front, or are you just like going, I'm just as quick as I can trying to get something cohesive together and then do that at the end?
I'm trying to build out structure initially, but you know, like anybody else, I have an audience that I have to show it to, and so I'm trying to convey my ideas. That's really what it comes down to. I'm not trying to do the best sound pass. Well, I want it to be good because the sloppier it is, the harder it is to really see through all that muck, if that makes sense, you know? So to my point about trying to make a tight cut, even in a rough cut, that's because I want people to make intelligent responses to what they're seeing and to get good feedback. And sometimes it's hard to see that through very, very rough cuts. I can only say that from my own experience, like watching some people's stuff, you know. I don't know. Sometimes I will get very in the weeds doing sound work and graphics work, but that's only to kind of convey what I want the audience to feel.
And speaking of feedback, how do you know what feedback to listen to? Like, obviously you listen to the director, but like when you guys are starting to do screenings and starting to see how people react to something or showing into those who are close to you and those who you trust, like how do you know what advice to take in and actually implement and which to say, oh, interesting, but not for this film?
Yeah. I mean, sometimes that happens where you just say, well, that's not the film we're doing, or you just, this, I believe in what I'm doing and I'm going to stick to it. But generally you're looking for consensus, you know? And if 10 people have a comment about something, well, that's a problem and you have to address it, you know? If James Brooks is giving you feedback on a cut, you're going to listen to it. That's just the way it is. But, yeah, I mean, that's the way I feel about it. I'm just kind of looking for consensus, and there are some things that will just jog you, and you say, oh, I never saw it that way. That's a problem, and you want to fix it.
Right, yeah, having fresh eyes on it.
I mean, the screenings are about getting perspective because you're so in it, and that's one of the biggest challenges when you're working on something and you're feverishly working on it is that you don't have perspective on it. I try to build in time to step away from it, like at least for a week or something like that, and not look at the cut and then come back and see it with fresh eyes.
When I imagine you're in screening rooms with multiple people watching your film. Do you feel their reaction sometimes? Like, is there what kind of with the comedy? Obviously, you see the laughter, but then there's kind of some kind of presence where you can tell if an audience is engaged, is really in tune with it.
My thing is just watching it with people, I instantly start to see things, that I wasn't seeing, That's in terms of perspective, like just seeing it in a different environment, everything shifts, and you see problems. Mm-hmm. Or you don't, or you're just like, man, this thing is fucking awesome.
Yeah. Is it tough to be able to look back on old projects? Are you, for me, sometimes like when I finish a project, I look back at it 2 years later and I'm like, I don't know. I can't it's hard for me to even watch old projects and I don't, but, the times that I have, or if I'm going to a screening, it's like, damn, like I would do so much differently now, having 2, 3, 4 years plus experience.
Only, I would only feel, I don't watch my stuff really. I don't have opportunities to, and it would be weird if I just sat at home watching old films.
Right, like, damn, I'm good.
Yeah, I've had, some random experiences to see stuff because, I don't know, I'm like asked to speak to a class or something like that. But no, because I think you just want to feel that that there wasn't a missed opportunity. Like that's the biggest fear when I'm doing these things, like the Cobain film, for instance, or the Shandling thing. It's like you want to do, this is the last time that film's going to be done. Like the Cobain film, that artwork is never, it's going to get auctioned off. It would never be available. You're not going to have the rights to all the music. So we had to do the best job we could with that film. And the pressure was on, and the same with Shandling. Like nobody's going to make another Shandling film. Mm-hmm. That's the one, So you want to make it as good as it can possibly be and do right by that person, but also make a work of art that stands on its own. So I don't know. I mean, if I had a lot of regrets about the experience, or what it came out to be, and that certainly happens, but that's a document of its time, and that's it. And there's no going back.
How do you keep, because it seems like you're obviously very passionate about these films and you put a lot of time and energy into it. I can't imagine the hours that it takes to put these films together. How do you maintain a balance when you're like with your personal life? Mm-hmm. You got a kid now, like how do you balance the two of them and make sure that you're giving yourself the personal space and time that you need while also being incredibly driven and passionate about the films you're making?
Um, well, it wasn't. I will say when I was working with Jed, those guys were great, and then my son was born when we started that film, and they gave me time to be with him. But in general, I mean, what I do now is I have the mornings with my son. I get into the edit at around 10 o'clock. I'll generally work till around 8, which I think, that length of time, I don't think you're going to be terribly productive after that. Everybody works differently. But I think if you're doing 12, 13 hours every day, you're at a certain point, it's all going to be crap, So that seems to work for me. And then I come home and just spend some time with my wife and do a reset,
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I feel like I'm fortunate where I'm not completely consumed by the work. You're always thinking about it, it's always part of you. But I think giving yourself space is actually helps the work. To that point about perspective, you know what I mean? Like usually your best ideas come when you're taking a walk or you're in the shower, that type of thing. Like that's when the breakthroughs happen.
Mm. Great, man. You want to do a couple quick questions here, and then we'll wrap up this podcast. You read much?
I try to, but not as much as I used to.
Has there been a book or a film that you've seen that has made the biggest impact on your life that maybe set things in perspective for you?
I mean, there's a book called City of God, which was written by E.L. Doctorow, which is not by any means one of his best books, but it informed my work. I remember because maybe the first third or the first half of it, it tells a story through scraps of paper and news clippings and little bits of work that somebody's doing to profile somebody else. And that, strangely enough, somehow that had an impression on me. It's, certainly part of what I'm doing now, where I'm working with scraps of minutia and things like that. So that's a book. The Limey, do you ever see that?
Mm-mm.
It's a Soderbergh film. Just from an editorial standpoint, it's amazing, and super weird, but it's a good film.
What makes it great?
Because time is disjointed. He'll have conversations that go on for 20 minutes, as other actions happening. So they're kind of flashbacks within flashbacks. I'm not doing a good job explaining it.
Mm-hmm.
But there is this other thing he does where he has one conversation take place in multiple setups. So like this conversation we're having right here, we'd be talking, and then that same dialogue would take place in a park. And he's just jumping between those. And somehow that made an impression on me as well.
Mm. It's almost like a lot of times we think that there's certain rules about how a film needs to be put together.
Mm-hmm.
And you can kind of just break that.
Yeah.
It was kind of like the Garry Shandling. It's the Garry Shandling show. Like how he breaks the wall and he talks to the audience. And like that, when I was watching it, I was like, that must have been groundbreaking at the time. Like nobody else must have even thought of that idea.
Well, the thing, I think it had been done before.
Yeah.
What the hell's his name? It's that guy from Oh God, remember? He had the cigars, and I can't remember his name right now.
Yeah, I don't know.
He was a comedian, but and somebody's going to be really mad at me for not remembering his name because he's like a legend.
Yeah.
But that show, that kind of idea had existed before. I mean, there's this weird thing. I don't think there are not necessarily original ideas. It's how you're packaging those ideas. You know what I mean?
Right. It's got to be nearly impossible to have something that's purely original. And if it is, it's probably so abstract it won't make any sense and it won't be interesting. So I think that's what it is about. It's always about like maybe taking what other people have done and doing it your own way.
Yeah.
Let's see here. What drives you? Like what pushes you from one project to the next? What keeps you going with these projects that you work on?
I'm just trying to do interesting work. I think there are aesthetic challenges and I'm trying to like jump at, so if something kind of excites me aesthetically, or if I feel like it's an opportunity to do something different and something new, then those are usually cases where I'll jump at it. Or if I have, if I can work with somebody that I'm excited to work with, there's also that.
What one skill have you leveraged in a way that you think others haven't? It's like an interview question.
What
like,
skill?
I guess, yeah, like what do you think that you've been able to hold on to that's been critical to your success?
I don't know. I just work hard, maybe there's, I think there's a certain level of arrogance I must have, that probably benefits me. There's something to, like, I've worked with, the people I work with, and you have to be able to tell that person, no, I think that's a bad idea. The only way you can help your director as an editor is to be able to push back. If you're just a facilitator, I don't necessarily agree with that. Certainly in the work we do, it needs to be a conversation. If you're only as good as the director is, then what are you really doing there? You have to be able to bring your own ideas and be able to push back. And that does take a certain level of arrogance. Or
confidence too. Just being confident in the work that you've done and knowing, and like trusting your gut, right?
Yeah. But it all goes into play. Like, Derek Jeter was a very humble guy, but clearly he had arrogance because people are going to tell you suck along the way,
Yeah.
And people are always going to question you. Like every time, there was a point where I would go into a room and I was like, these people don't believe in me, and and I'm going to show them. And that was the thing that really drove me a lot. I would go into a place and they thought that I wasn't going to work out, and I was kind of very intent on showing them that they didn't know what they were talking about.
Proving yourself.
Yeah.
When are you happiest?
Nowadays when I'm with my son.
Let's see here. A couple more questions. What's
and
one?
My wife.
And my wife. Can't forget that. Shit. What one thing should people read, watch, or listen to before they go to bed tonight? What's besides John Smith, This American Life?
Before they go to bed tonight, I've been watching Legion. I enjoy that show a lot. Mm-hmm. I don't know. But I'm unfortunately not able to watch a ton of stuff recently.
It's hard to watch when you're cutting so much.
Yeah, but it's important to kind of consume stuff. So it's like a thing that I'm concerned about, to be honest. I feel like I'm not doing a good job just reading and consuming.
That's, dude, I'm like completely in the same boat as you. And when you're in the creation mode, all you want to do is get back to the thing you were making to keep going and to keep pushing yourself. But then I don't know, part of me is like, maybe I should just take one day a week, or like maybe mornings on Sunday to create or to consume, to watch something, to listen to a podcast. It's just hard because you have to do the work before that moment to find out what you're actually going to consume. But
you'll do that and it'll find its way into your, to use the Shandling thing as an example, there's that sequence where it's him and Lendo and they're kind of facing off, and I do that stupid split screen thing.
Right.
But that I ripped that off from Fargo because I was watching Fargo one night. I was like, oh, that's an interesting way to do this sequence.
Yeah, I love that. I thought that worked really well. But it's like, that's cool. And I was actually talking to Joel West, who's a composer, and he was kind of saying the same thing, where he's like, I'm constantly trying to pull inspiration, but I want to know where it came from.
People should watch Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control. There you go.
That's Fast, Cheap, and Out of Control.
Yeah, which is an Errol Morris film. And I feel, on some weird level, like everything I'm doing, I'm trying to achieve what's going on in that movie.
Yeah, awesome. And last question, what's the best place for people to find you online if they want to see your work or if they wanted to connect with you and say hi?
I have a website, which is shablabs.com.
Shablabs.com.
Yeah, it's not a good website, but
I think it works.
It does. Yeah, it does what it's supposed to do.
Cool.
Yeah.
All right, man. Thanks so much for doing the podcast.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And that's this week's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you for watching. Appreciate you tuning in. That's it. I got nothing else to say. I got nothing else to add. But I'll see you next week.